Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Public Policy, Section 11, where we are going to be talking about mass incarceration, which is a very large, important issue faced by the United States in the 20th and 21st century. Now, historically, going back more than 100 or 200 years, incarceration has been a relative rarity, okay? Most crimes were punished either by corporal punishment, whipping, lashing, the stocks, the pillory, things like that, or if it was serious enough, death. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the death penalty in a future section. But historically, death was carried out by an axe or a sword, sometimes by hanging. That was a very popular one for a long time. And actually, in the 18th century, a French person created the guillotine as a more humane, effective way to execute people. We view it kind of now culturally as this barbaric tool of rampant death and destruction, but at the time of its creation, it was a humane way to perform all these executions in France. But because so much crime was punished either by corporal punishment or by death, prisons were just temporary holding facilities, more akin to today's jails, right? People would be incarcerated awaiting trial or after a trial but awaiting the punishment to actually be carried out. They wouldn't spend large amounts of time incarcerated in what we would think of as a prison the way so many of the punished criminals in the modern world do. The conditions in these early prisons, of course, were also very crowded. Men, women, children, all housed together. Very, what we would say today are deplorable conditions. Then, in roughly the 18th century, we had the Enlightenment. People started thinking about things a little more scientifically. People started looking at crime in a more logical way rather than a religious or supernatural or spiritual way. The two big thinkers when it came to punishment in this Enlightenment period were Beccaria and Bentham. Beccaria, famous for the creation of deterrence theory, which we'll talk about a little bit more in this section. And Bentham, of course, coming up with utilitarianism. And the two of them kind of bounced ideas off of each other and helped each other create those respective ideals. We got this increased focus on incarceration as a punishment rather than corporal punishment or execution. But in order to have that incarceration as a long-term place to keep large numbers of people, some of the first really large major prisons were run by various religious groups, especially here in the United States, the Quakers. These were kind of combination prison and church, and this is where we get the modern term penitentiary, right? So a penitentiary is kind of, in the modern day, just another word for a prison. But back in this kind of time period, a penitentiary was a place where you would go to be penitent, i.e. pay a religious price and spend time seeking forgiveness from your Creator, from your God, right? Now, in the 19th century, there was a shift from this Enlightenment thinking towards more positivistic thinking. And positivism is just kind of a way of viewing reality that says there is an objective truth with a capital T. And it is science's job and society's job and kind of the learned person's job to discover that truth with a capital T. Another thing that was on the rise in this late 19th century kind of time period was the field of psychology, right? And people started looking at crime as the result of a disordered mind, as the result of bad upbringing, as the result of mental illness, sickness, lack of socialization. And thus the focus shifted towards rehabilitation. Another one of the big issues at this period of time was that these religious penitentiaries, which had started off with very kind of noble purpose, run by churches with the desire to help people become better people, had by the mid to late 18th century or 19th century turned into really, really horrible places to be. Sickness, death, physical punishments, neglect. They were very, very horrible places for people to spend time in. So there was a shift to focusing on rehabilitation. These are people. We need to make them better, whether that's because of mental illness or because of a lack of socialization or whatever. We need to rehabilitate them, bring them to be more like normal people, right? And this is kind of one of the big focuses of the punishment field into the early to mid 20th century. And during this period, kind of the late 19th century into the mid 20th century, the prison population in the United States held steady at roughly 100 people per 100,000 population, right? When we talk about incarceration rates, we always talk about some number per 100,000 population. And that allows you to compare either large cities and small cities or large states and small states, or even large countries and small countries, right? Because if we look at it just in sheer numbers, of course the larger city or the larger state or the larger country is going to have more people incarcerated. But if you look at it per 100,000 people in their population, we can do a little more apples to apples comparison, right? So whenever you see an incarceration rate, especially in my videos, but also just anywhere in the criminal justice literature, it's almost always presented as the rate per 100,000 population. So early 20th century, we got 100 people per 100,000 population in prison, roughly, on average. It varied a little, obviously, but it kind of hung out around that number for a large part of that kind of late 19th, early 20th century kind of timeline. Then in the late 20th century, we had this kind of right-wing shift in society and politics. Everything from Nixon in the 60s through Reagan in the 80s, and lots of others. We had the war on crime. We had the war on drugs, right? And we stopped seeing criminals as people in need of rehabilitation, and we shifted back towards that deterrence focus from Beccaria, but with the added focus on what's called selective incapacitation, right? And selective incapacitation means if we take kind of the people who commit the most number of crimes and incapacitate them, i.e. put them in prison where they can no longer commit crimes, then we can reduce the number of crimes that are committed in any given city or state or country. So if we take those worst of the worst, the ones that are going to, if they leave prison, go out and commit a bunch more crimes, if we take those people and lock them up for longer periods of time, they are going to be committing far less crime over the course of their lifetimes, and thus we will have much lower crime rates in whatever area we're removing them from in order to put them in prison. And all of these factors kind of combined to skyrocket the incarceration rate in the United States. In 2007, it reached a peak of 670 per 100,000. Now remember, for most of the first half of the 20th century, it was about 100 per 100,000. In 2007, it was almost 7 times that rate of people being in prison. Now, luckily, since 2007, it started dropping, and the latest numbers I could find prior to recording this video are from 2022, where there was 541 per 100,000. So it's still nowhere near coming down to the rate it was in the first half of the 20th century, but it is fairly significantly below that 2007 peak. To put this in context, and again, to try to kind of get you to understand why this is abnormal and different, the 541 for the United States is by far the highest in the world. There is no country on this planet that incarcerates people at the rate the United States does. The one possible exception to that is China. According to their official statistics, they are far below the 541 number. But there are some researchers and some investigators who think that China is vastly underreporting their numbers. Whether that's true or not, I really can't say. But literally every other country in the world has an incarceration rate, with the possible exception of China, far below that of the United States. Now, I went looking for some numbers just prior to recording this, and these were the latest numbers I could find for the G8 countries. These are the countries that are kind of the largest economically, obviously focused on the West. But the USA at 541 is the clear top one. Russia, who's no longer in the G8, is now referred to the G7, but even Russia, which has kind of a reputation in the West for human rights abuses, has an incarceration rate slightly over half of what the United States has. And then, of course, there's the UK, France, Italy, Canada, Germany, Japan, all with vastly, vastly lower incarceration rates compared to the United States. So all of these countries are living in the same kind of global context, but all of these countries have much lower rates of incarceration than the United States does. Why? Well, for one thing, one of the factors we can kind of look at when it comes to incarceration rates is the fact that incarceration rates are nowhere near even or uniform across race, age, and gender. Okay? For one thing, there's the age crime curve. So for those of you who don't know, if you graph out crimes committed based on the age of the offender, there is a swift increase in the kind of teenage years, peaks in the late teens, early 20s, and then it slowly drops off and goes down, 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 down to reach basically zero in old age. So that age crime curve with the rapid increase and then the slow decrease as people age is one of the most kind of agreed upon statistics in the entirety of the criminal justice field. And we're going to get back to the age crime curve in the second half of this section. But prisons, prior to this mass incarceration phenomenon, prisons were vastly kind of overrepresented with younger people, late teens, early 20s, that kind of thing. Now, when it comes to gender, that drop-off between 2007 and now is almost entirely due to the lowered incarceration rate for men. Women have actually had a slight increase in the incarceration rate in that same time period. So female offending and male offending, men have always offended at far higher rates than women. But as time goes on, those rates are converging. And they haven't converged yet, but they're getting closer and closer and closer. And who knows, maybe someday they will actually converge and men and women will commit crimes and be punished for crimes at very similar rates. Why that's happening, why the male and female crime rates are converging, there's lots of theories out there, lots of ideas, but it is happening, right? When it comes to race, race is one of the most important subjects in any historical or sociological or economic or criminal justice discussion in the United States. It permeates everything in the United States. Some of the racial difference we see in incarceration can be explained by differential offending. People in minority groups, African American, Hispanic, Native American, people in those groups actually do commit crime at a higher rate than what they would be expected to commit based on their proportion of the population. And there's lots of argument about why that is. The answer is probably very complex. Everything from economic situations to racial discrimination to lack of educational and job opportunities. But some of this difference we see in the incarceration rates for different races and ethnic groups can be explained by the fact that those groups actually do offend at different rates, but nowhere near all of it. There is a difference in offending between racial and ethnic groups, but there is a much larger difference in incarceration rates between racial and ethnic groups. Now, again, there is a vast amount of controversy and argument and lots of different ideas on why. One of the leading ones is about small amounts of discretion, right? We have a very large criminal justice system, and there are a ton of different steps in the process, and people and organizations and agencies between offending and prison. And if each one of those stages has just a little bit of discretion and a little bit of prejudice, that's going to compile and compile and compile so that at the end, that little bit of prejudice and little bit of discretion at each stage results in a very large difference kind of at the end of that process, i.e. prisons. So even if people aren't overtly or even consciously being discriminatory, even if each step from the police to the prosecutors to the judges to the investigators to the everything, even if each step has just a very small difference from people who would never consciously do anything differently to different racial groups, we're still going to see this large result at the end of that process. Now, other factors involving incarceration and people's odds of becoming incarcerated include mental illness. And the mentally ill are not more likely to commit large violent crimes. But they are more likely to be incarcerated because there is a decided lack of resources and facilities for mentally ill people in the United States. And thus, sometimes the state's only option for getting them off the street is to arrest them and put them in prison for a relatively minor offense or crime or situation. Drug addiction has similar processes, similar social impact, where there's not a lot of resources for people addicted to drugs, and thus A lot of times police will arrest them for relatively minor crimes, and judges will punish them for relatively minor crimes, because being in prison or being arrested is kind of the only option they have other than just letting them out on the street to continue to abuse drugs. Education is another large factor in incarceration. The higher the educational attainment of any given person, the less likely they are to be incarcerated. Prisons are vastly overrepresented by people either without a high school degree or with a high school degree but no college experience. So each step up of that educational ladder reduces the likelihood that someone will end up incarcerated at any point in their life cycle. One of the biggest kind of factors driving this incarceration issue is the economic cycle of people lacking economic opportunity. So they kind of either get forced into or go into doing some type of crime, whether it be burglary or drugs or whatever, which causes them to be arrested and imprisoned, which causes them to lose even more economic opportunity, which causes them to then turn to more crime, which causes them to get punished again, which causes them to lose even more economic opportunity. And this happens not just with those people, but with their families as well, right? This affects children, spouses, siblings. When anybody in the family is arrested and goes to prison, especially for long periods of time, that increases the economic strain on the rest of the family, which then leads to more crime, which then leads to more incarceration, which then leads to more crime, which then leads to more incarceration, in a vicious economic cycle where it reaches the point where communities and families and entire groups of people really lack the opportunities to do anything legal with their lives. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in just a moment.